The wind had been picking up steadily all day, and by the time we reached the old gas station on the edge of a dense stretch of woods in Maine, it was howling. The trees bowed and swayed, their fiery orange and red leaves scattering across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Rex, my German shepherd, sat upright in the back seat of the SUV, ears pricked and nose twitching as he scanned the landscape. We'd been driving for hours, me and my two closest friends, Marcus and Emily. The trip was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to unwind before the holiday rush. I'd brought Rex along because, frankly, I trusted his instincts better than my own sometimes. A zookeeper in Boston, I'd spent years working with animals, and Rex had been my companion through it all, his keen awareness saving me more than once during training runs in the city's parks. The gas station looked ancient, its peeling paint and creaky wooden sign barely visible in the dim autumn light. As I filled the tank, Marcus went inside for snacks, and Emily stayed by the car, scrolling through her phone. The wind was colder than I'd expected, and I tugged my jacket tighter. Then Rex growled. It wasn't his usual bark, the one he used for delivery drivers or squirrels. This was low and guttural, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I followed his gaze to the woods beyond the station. At first, I saw nothing, just the swaying trees and shadows that danced with the wind. But then, between two trunks, something moved. It was subtle, just a shift of dark against dark. But it was enough. I froze, my hand tightening on the gas pump handle. Rex growled again, his teeth bared. "What is it?" Emily asked, looking up. "Stay by the car," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Marcus returned, a bag of chips in one hand and a confused look on his face. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I said, still staring at the woods. "But something's out there." The wind carried a faint sound, a rustling, then a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. Whatever it wasn't small. We hurried back into the car and I started the engine. As we pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. But then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows. "Did you see that?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "I don't know what I saw," I replied, gripping the wheel. We drove in tense silence for a while, the wind buffeting the car and the woods pressing close on either side of the narrow road. Rex didn't relax, his ears still alert and his gaze fixed on the windows. When the road led us to a small clearing with a fire pit and a picnic table, we decided to stop and regroup. The gas station encounter had left us all on edge, but we tried to laugh it off, joking about horror movies and urban legends. The fire crackled as we sat around it, the warmth a welcome relief from the biting wind. It was Emily who brought up the local folklore. "They say Maine is full of weird stuff," she said, poking the fire with a stick. "Ghosts, cryptids, werewolves even." "Werewolves?" Marcus scoffed. "Yeah," Emily said. "I read about it online. Some locals claim they've seen green creatures in the woods. Big, fast, and not entirely human." I didn't say anything, but her words stuck with me. Years ago, I'd read something similar in one of those sensationalist magazines you find in waiting rooms. At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now I wasn't so sure. Rex stood suddenly, his ears flat against his head. The fur along his spine bristled. "What is it, boy?" I asked, rising to my feet. The wind carried a sound again, closer this time. A growl, low and menacing, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves. We killed the fire and doused the embers, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The shadows in the woods seemed to shift and ripple, as if something massive was circling us. As we made our way back to the car, the creature emerged from the tree line, just for a moment. It was huge, its body covered in dark fur, its eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. It didn't charge, didn't roar, it simply watched, its posture low and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. We moved faster, Rex growling and snapping at the air as if trying to ward it off. The creature didn't follow us directly, but we could hear it, always just out of sight, stalking us through the underbrush. By the time we reached the car, my hands were shaking. We piled in, and I hit the gas, the tires spinning briefly before catching the gravel. The road back to town felt endless, the woods pressing in on all sides. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a potential threat. We didn't stop until we were back at the gas station, its familiar, dilapidated sign a strange comfort. Only then did I call the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't just a story. Spring in the Appalachians was meant to be tranquil. The ridges stretched endlessly, their peaks dotted with the fresh green of new leaves. The travel agency had promised an unforgettable retreat, a remote cabin tucked into the woods, perfect for recharging from the grind of everyday life. For Viggo Wick, who had come all the way from Boulder, the idea of leaving his retail job behind for a few days seemed too good to pass up. Viggo had always loved the wilderness. Back home, when he wasn't working, he spent weekends hunting in the Rockies, navigating dense forests, and tracking deer with the ease of someone who knew how to read the land. That familiarity was part of why this trip appealed to him. And to his surprise, the Appalachian woods carried a different kind of beauty, a softer, more ancient feel than the rugged terrain he knew back home. The first few days passed uneventfully. Viggo and the small group of travelers explored trails, shared meals around the fire, and marveled at how the mountains seemed to roll forever into the horizon. The cabin they stayed in was rustic but comfortable, and the cool, windy spring nights were perfect for stories and laughter under a blanket of stars. It wasn't until the third night that things began to change. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters of the cabin as the group huddled around the fire pit outside. Someone had just finished telling a ghost story, and the mood was light, filled with laughter and the occasional teasing scare. Viggo had been leaning back in his chair, letting the warmth of the flames seep into his bones, when a noise cut through the night. It was faint at first, a low, guttural growl, carried on the wind like a whisper. Everyone froze, their laughter dying instantly. "Did you hear that?" someone asked, their voice barely above a murmur. Viggo sat up, his senses immediately on edge. He'd heard something similar before back in Colorado, but there was an unfamiliar quality to this sound, something that made his skin crawl. "It's probably just a coyote," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. The group exchanged uneasy glances, and one by one, they began retreating to the safety of the cabin. Viggo lingered by the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flickering light. The woods seemed different now, the trees looming taller and the shadows deeper. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a dark figure crouched low to the ground, almost indistinguishable from the undergrowth. But as Viggo's eyes adjusted, he caught the faint glint of eyeshine, like twin pinpricks of light staring back at him. He didn't move, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The figure shifted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Viggo thought he could make out the silhouette of a large wolf-like creature. But its movements were wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. The growl came again, louder this time, and Viggo's heart pounded in his chest. He took a slow step back, keeping his eyes on the creature as he moved toward the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and joined the others, who were already on edge. They tried to rationalize what he'd seen, a bear maybe, or a large dog that had wandered too far from home. But Viggo couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else. That night, none of them slept well. The next day, they found tracks in the soft earth near the fire pit. They were massive, resembling paw prints, but with an unsettlingly human-like quality. Viggo thought back to an article he'd read years ago in one of those yellow newspapers, the kind that talked about UFO sightings and cryptid legends. It had mentioned something about Dogman sightings in the Midwest and Appalachians. At the time, he dismissed it as nonsense. Now, he wasn't so sure. As the day wore on, the unease grew. The group stayed close to the cabin, their laughter and conversations replaced by nervous glances and whispered speculations. By late afternoon, one of the travelers, a man named Eric, wandered too far into the woods and didn't come back. A search party was organized, but the forest seemed to swallow sound, their calls for Eric fading into the wind. Viggo found himself leading the group, his hunting experience making him the most capable in the situation. Night fell quickly, and with it came the howling wind. The group returned to the cabin, their fear palpable. Viggo stayed by the window, watching the tree line as the others huddled together in the living room. Just before midnight, there was a sound at the door. A soft, deliberate scratching. Viggo motioned for silence, his knife in hand as he approached. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there. The rest of the night was a blur of tension and fear. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the growls outside grew more frequent. By morning, it was clear they couldn't stay. The group packed quickly, their plan to head to the nearest town on foot since their car batteries had mysteriously drained overnight. They moved quietly through the woods, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. But they weren't alone. The creature followed them, its presence a constant, oppressive weight. They caught glimpses of it, a flash of fur, the glint of eyes, but it never attacked outright. It was toying with them, driving them deeper into panic. By the time they reached the outskirts of a small village, the group was exhausted and terrified. Viggo turned to look back at the woods one last time and thought he saw the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching them with an almost human intelligence. They reported what had happened to the locals, who listened with grim expressions. One old man nodded knowingly and muttered something about the Dogman, an ancient guardian of the forest, or perhaps something far darker. Viggo never returned to the Appalachians, but he never forgot the creature either. The story I'm about to tell you was shared with me by a man who swore it was true. It happened to his friend Arnold Smith, a Boston police officer who knew his way around tough situations and had the scars to prove it. Arnold loved two things, fixing cars and the open road. Whenever he could, he'd pack up his old truck and take off with his dog, Buck. Buck was a sturdy German Shepherd mix with an energy that mirrored Arnold's relentless drive. This particular spring, Arnold decided to head west, aiming for a quiet few days exploring Wisconsin. The forest there had always intrigued him, vast, sprawling, and ancient in a way that made you feel small. It started innocently enough. Arnold, Buck, and a small group of friends from the Midwest were on a casual road trip. They stopped at a remote gas station off a lonely stretch of road to refuel and grab some snacks. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but never quite delivered, casting a pale gray light over everything. The gas station attendant was an older man, gruff but friendly, with the kind of face that had seen too much. When Arnold mentioned they were heading into the woods to camp for a few days, the man's expression shifted. "Be careful out there," he said, almost absently as he wiped his hands on an old rag. Arnold raised an eyebrow. "Something we should know?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Just don't go too deep. Folks around here hear things." The comment stuck with Arnold, but he didn't mention it to the others. They were in good spirits as they left the station and made their way to a secluded camping spot deep in the woods. The first day passed without incident. The group set up camp, explored nearby trails, and took turns keeping the fire stoked as the evening chill set in. Arnold loved moments like this, the simplicity of it all. He'd grown up in a tight-knit family where nights around the fire had been a cherished tradition, and memories of those times often resurfaced during trips like these. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It was Buck who noticed it first. The dog had been lying by the fire, his ears twitching occasionally at the sounds of the forest. But then he stiffened, his head snapping toward the darkness beyond the trees. A low growl rumbled in his throat, and the fur along his back bristled. Arnold followed Buck's gaze, but saw nothing. "Probably a deer," he muttered, though the unease in his voice was clear. The others dismissed it, but Buck wouldn't settle. He paced the edge of the camp, his growls growing more frequent. Arnold decided to stay up a little later, keeping an eye on things while the others went to their tents. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Arnold stood, his hand instinctively resting on the knife at his belt. The figure moved again, and this time he caught a clearer look. It was tall, impossibly so, and covered in dark fur that seemed to blend into the shadows. It moved with a strange, deliberate gait, almost as if it were trying to mimic human movements, but not quite getting it right. Arnold's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen something like this before, not in person, but on one of those late-night TV shows that covered urban legends and cryptid sightings. Bigfoot. The creature didn't attack right away. It circled the camp, staying just out of reach of the firelight. Arnold's heart raced as he tried to decide what to do. If it was what he thought, they were in serious trouble. Then Buck charged. The dog barked furiously, sprinting into the trees before Arnold could stop him. There was a sound, a deafening roar that echoed through the forest, and then silence. "Buck!" Arnold shouted, running toward the noise. He found the dog a few yards away, limping back toward him with a deep gash across his side. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but Arnold could feel it watching. He got Buck back to camp, his hands shaking as he cleaned the wound. The others woke up, and panic spread quickly as Arnold explained what had happened. They decided they couldn't stay. Gathering what they could, the group left the fire burning and moved as quickly as possible through the woods. The creature followed them, its presence a constant, oppressive weight. Occasionally, they heard it, heavy footsteps snapping branches or low, guttural sounds that sent shivers down their spines. They tried calling for help, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. One of the group members, a man named Jerry, lagged behind and let out a scream that was abruptly cut off. They didn't see him again. Arnold led the group, his mind racing as he tried to remember the layout of the area from the map they'd studied earlier. The cloudy sky made it hard to navigate, but he trusted his instincts, keeping them moving toward what he hoped was the direction of the nearest village. The final stretch was the worst. The creature grew bolder, charging at them from the shadows, but never fully committing to an attack. It was as if it wanted to scare them, to drive them into complete panic. When they finally stumbled out of the woods and into the outskirts of a small village, they collapsed in exhaustion. Arnold looked back once, expecting to see the creature standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. The locals listened to their story with grim expressions. One old man nodded knowingly. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "Not everyone does." Arnold never went back to Wisconsin. He still dreams about that trip sometimes, about the shadows in the trees and the thing that watched them from the darkness. Buck recovered, but the dog was never quite the same after that night. And Arnold, he no longer doubts the stories about what lurks in the woods.